The cabin smelled like wet earth and forgotten promises. Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway, her daughter's hand clutching hers so tightly it hurt, staring at what was supposed to be their salvation. 300 miles of driving on fumes and hope had led them here, to a rotting structure nestled between two giant sequoias so massive they seemed to swallow the sky. The inheritance letter had called it a mountain retreat. The reality was a collapsing roof, shattered windows, and walls covered in moss thick enough to peel away in sheets. Behind her, the social worker's car idled in the clearing, waiting to see if Sarah would actually go through with this insane plan or finally admit defeat and sign the papers that would take Emma away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started with an eviction notice taped to their apartment door in Sacramento. 24 hours to vacate. Sarah had stood there in the hallway, still wearing her waitress uniform from the graveyard shift, reading the words over and over until they stopped making sense. 3 months behind on rent. No warning. No mercy. Emma had watched from inside, her 7-year-old face pressed against the gap in the door, already learning how quickly the world could turn cruel. That's when Sarah remembered the letter. It had arrived 6 weeks ago, forwarded through 3 different addresses before finally catching up with them. Her great-aunt Vera, a woman Sarah had met exactly twice in her childhood, had died at 93 in a nursing home in Redding. The estate was minimal, the lawyer's letter explained. No money. No stocks. Just a small property in the Sierra Nevada foothills that had been in the family since the logging days of the 1920s. The taxes were current through the end of the year. After that, the county would claim it. Sarah had thrown the letter away. What use was a cabin in the mountains when you couldn't afford groceries? But standing in that hallway with the eviction notice, watching her daughter's frightened eyes, she had dug through the trash and found it again. The address was listed as Forest Route 47, Trinity County. No street number. No landmarks. Just coordinates and a note that said access road requires 4-wheel drive. Her Honda Civic had barely made it. The last 5 miles had been dirt and gravel, switchbacks so steep Sarah's hands had cramped from gripping the steering wheel. Emma had been silent the entire drive, clutching the stuffed rabbit that was the only toy Sarah hadn't sold or pawned. They'd passed exactly 2 other vehicles, both pickup trucks with rifle racks and drivers who stared at them like they were ghosts already. Now the social worker, a tired woman named Patricia Chen, stepped out of her sedan and approached with that careful, sympathetic expression Sarah had learned to hate. Mrs. Mitchell, I need to document the living conditions. If this property is inhabitable, if there's no running water or electricity, I'm required to take Emma into protective custody until you can establish stable housing. Sarah's jaw tightened. Give me 48 hours. Patricia glanced at the cabin, then back at Sarah. The doubt was clear in her eyes. I can give you tonight. Tomorrow morning I'll return with my supervisor. If conditions haven't improved significantly, we'll have no choice. After Patricia's car disappeared down the rutted road, Sarah and Emma stood alone in the clearing. The silence of the mountains was absolute, broken only by wind moving through the sequoia branches high above. Sarah had grown up in cities, foster homes scattered across California's Central Valley. She knew concrete and streetlights and the sound of sirens. This wilderness felt like standing on another planet. Mama, Emma whispered, tugging her sleeve. I'm scared. Sarah knelt down, forcing her voice steady even as panic clawed at her chest. Me too, baby. But we're going to figure this out. We always do. The cabin was worse inside than out. A single large room with a loft accessible by a ladder with missing rungs. The wood stove in the corner had collapsed in on itself, rust and debris scattered across the floor. What had once been a kitchen consisted of a dry sink and open shelves covered in rodent droppings. The windows, those that still had glass, were so dirty they barely let in light. But there was a roof. Damaged, yes, but intact enough to provide shelter. And when Sarah tested the hand pump by the sink, after several minutes of desperate cranking, brown water eventually sputtered out. Not safe to drink without boiling, but water nonetheless. She spent the next hour clearing space, sweeping debris with a broom she fashioned from pine branches, setting up their few belongings in the least damaged corner. Emma helped wordlessly, her small hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a child who'd learned to adapt quickly. They'd been homeless before, 3 months in Sarah's car the previous winter. This was better than that. It had to be. As twilight settled over the mountains, Sarah managed to start a fire in the remains of the wood stove using newspaper and kindling from the forest floor. The warmth felt miraculous. Emma curled up in their sleeping bag, finally falling into exhausted sleep while Sarah sat watch, her mind racing through impossible calculations. How to make this place livable? How to find work in a region where the nearest town was 30 miles away? How to keep her daughter safe and fed and in school? The great sequoias outside creaked and groaned in the wind, their massive trunks creating sounds like distant thunder. Sarah had read somewhere that these trees could live 3,000 years, that their root systems spread for acres, connecting trees to each other through an underground network. Looking at them now through the cracked window, she felt the weight of their ancient presence. They had survived fires, droughts, loggers with axes and saws. They were still standing. She would be too. The next morning arrived with fog so thick Sarah could barely see 10 feet beyond the cabin. She woke Emma early, heating water from the pump to wash their faces, rationing out the last of their cereal bars for breakfast. They had maybe $40 left. Enough for gas to get back to Sacramento, if they left now. If they gave up. Sarah was pulling on her jacket, preparing to explore the property and assess what repairs were most urgent, when she heard the sound of an engine. Not Patricia's sedan, she realized with relief. Something heavier. A truck. The vehicle that emerged from the fog was a mud-splattered Ford with a camper shell, Forest Service decals on the door. The driver who stepped out was a woman in her 60s, weathered and solid, wearing a canvas jacket and boots that had seen decades of use. She studied Sarah with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. "You're Vera's kin," the woman stated rather than asked. "Got your mother's cheekbones." "I'm Ruth Hendricks. My family's land borders yours to the south. Saw smoke from your stove yesterday." Sarah stepped forward, instinctively positioning herself between this stranger and the cabin where Emma still waited inside. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. This is my property now." Ruth's expression didn't change. "Property's a generous word for what you've inherited. Vera let this place go to rot her last 20 years. Stubbornness kept her from selling even when she couldn't maintain it anymore." "I'm going to fix it up," Sarah said, hearing the defensive edge in her voice. Ruth glanced at the cabin, at Sarah's worn clothing and too-thin frame, at the Honda Civic with its cracked windshield. "Sure you are." She reached into her truck bed and pulled out a cardboard box. "Brought you some supplies. Canned goods, mostly. Water purification tablets. Chainsaws in there too. You'll need it for clearing deadfall before fire season." Sarah stared at the box, then at Ruth. "Why would you help me?" "Because Vera was a difficult woman, but she was my neighbor for 40 years. And because I recognized the look in your eyes." Ruth's voice softened slightly. "You're running from something. Figured you earned a chance to catch your breath." Before Sarah could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, her small face cautious. Ruth's expression transformed, the hardness replaced by something gentler. "And who's this?" "This is Emma," Sarah said, her hand finding her daughter's shoulder. "Emma, say hello to Mrs. Hendricks." "Just Ruth," the older woman corrected, crouching down to Emma's level. "You like the mountains, little one?" Emma nodded shyly. "The trees are really big." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Those are giant sequoias," Ruth explained. "Some of them have been here since before this country existed. The two by your cabin, we call them the Sentinels. Local legend says they've protected this land from every disaster that's tried to claim it." After Ruth left, Sarah unpacked the supplies with something close to hope stirring in her chest. The chainsaw was old but functional. The canned goods would feed them for at least 2 weeks. Maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. She spent the rest of the morning exploring the property. Vera's land was roughly 5 acres, most of its steep hillside covered in pines and undergrowth. The 2 giant sequoias dominated the clearing, their trunks wider than Sarah's car was long. Behind the cabin, she discovered the remains of what had once been a larger structure, just a stone foundation and scattered timbers now. And beyond that, half hidden by ferns and blackberry brambles, a small shed with a padlocked door. The padlock was so rusted it broke apart when Sarah hit it with a rock. Inside, the shed smelled of mildew and old wood. Light filtered through gaps in the walls, illuminating shelves lined with mason jars of forgotten preserves, coils of rope, tools so old their wooden handles had gone gray. But what caught Sarah's attention was the metal box on the top shelf, the size of a small suitcase, with Vera's name written across the lid in faded marker. Sarah lifted it down carefully. It wasn't locked. Inside she found papers, mostly old property deeds. Receipts from a lumber company dated 1947. Photographs of serious-faced men standing beside massive fallen trees, axes and crosscut saws in their hands. And at the bottom, a leather-bound journal with Vera's name embossed on the cover. Sarah carried the box back to the cabin where Emma was drawing pictures with pencils Ruth had included in the supply box. While her daughter worked, Sarah opened the journal and began to read. The first entries were from 1952, written in Vera's careful script. She had been 23 then, newly married to a logger named Thomas Brennan. They'd bought this land with money saved from 5 years of brutal work in the timber camps. The cabin had been their dream, a place to build a life away from the company towns and the constant danger of falling trees. But Thomas had died less than a year later, crushed when a widowmaker, a broken branch hanging in a tree's crown, had fallen during a storm. Vera had stayed anyway, alone on the mountain, refusing to sell to the timber companies that wanted to harvest the giant sequoias on her property. The journal documented her battles, legal and otherwise, to protect the trees. Threats from company representatives. Offers of money she desperately needed but wouldn't accept. Her belief that some things were worth more than profit. Sarah read entry after entry, watching Vera's life unfold in careful handwriting that grew shakier over the decades. The loneliness. The determination. The conviction that she was protecting something important, though she couldn't quite articulate what. And then, dated June 15, 1978, an entry that made Sarah's breath catch. Today I followed the old logger's tale. Hollis Tucker, who worked these mountains in the 20s, once told me about the sentinel trees and what lies beneath. I thought he was drunk and spinning yarns. But I measured and paced like he described, and I found the markers. Stone cairns hidden in the undergrowth, positioned exactly where he said. If Hollis was telling the truth about the markers, perhaps he was telling the truth about what they guard. Tomorrow I'll investigate further. If I'm right about what's down there, it changes everything. The next entry was 3 weeks later, as if those intervening days had been deliberately left blank. I was right. God help me, I was right. After that, nothing. The remaining pages of the journal were empty. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. Markers? Guard? What had Vera found? Outside, the sun was dropping toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. Patricia would return tomorrow morning, and Sarah still hadn't made the cabin remotely livable. She should be focused on survival, on making the place safe for Emma. But that journal entry gnawed at her, Vera's words echoing in her mind. If I'm right about what's down there, it changes everything. Sarah looked at her daughter, carefully coloring a picture of the giant trees. Whatever Vera had discovered, she'd kept it secret for decades. She'd lived in poverty, refused to sell land that would have made her comfortable, died alone in a nursing home with nothing to show for a lifetime of stubbornness. Unless there had been a reason. Unless she'd been protecting something more than just trees. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Sarah took a flashlight and went back outside. The journal had mentioned stone cairns in the undergrowth. markers positioned deliberately. She walked slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, sweeping the flashlight beam across the forest floor. It took almost an hour before she found the first one. A pile of stones stacked carefully, too deliberate to be natural. Moss-covered and ancient, but unmistakably human-made. She marked the spot with a piece of torn fabric tied to a nearby branch, then continued searching. The second cairn was 30 yards away, at a precise angle from the first. The third was equidistant from the other two, forming the point of a triangle. And at the center of that triangle, between the two massive sequoia trunks, the ground was different. Not just earth and pine needles, but something harder beneath. Stone, partially exposed where decades of rain and erosion had worn away the soil. Sarah knelt and began scraping away dirt with her hands. The stone was flat and worked, clearly shaped by tools. As she cleared more earth away, she realized it was covering something. A depression in the ground, deliberately concealed. She should wait for daylight. She should be rational and careful. But something drove her forward, the same desperation that had brought her to this mountain in the first place. The same refusal to surrender that had kept Vera here for 60 years. Sarah pried at the stone slab with a branch, leveraging it up inch by inch until she could shift it aside. Beneath was darkness, a space that descended into the earth between the sequoia roots. The massive root system of the sentinels had grown around and through whatever lay below, creating a natural vault. Sarah aimed her flashlight into the opening, and her breath stopped. Buried in the dirt, partially wrapped in rotting canvas and scattered among the ancient roots, were stones. But not just any stones. Even in the dim beam of her flashlight, even covered in decades of earth and grime, they caught the light in a way that was unmistakable. The pure, brilliant flash of diamonds. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached into the opening, her fingers brushing against canvas so old it disintegrated at her touch. The stones beneath were real, solid, and when she pulled one free and wiped away the caked dirt, the facets caught the moonlight with an unmistakable brilliance. She'd never held a diamond before, never been within 10 feet of one, but even her untrained eye could see these weren't glass or quartz. The weight was wrong, too heavy for their size, and the way they refracted light was something else entirely. She pulled out another. Then another. They varied in size from her thumbnail to larger than a quarter, rough cut but clearly processed, wrapped in bundles with rotting twine. How many were there? Dozens? Hundreds? Sarah's mind reeled, trying to calculate value, trying to understand what she was looking at. This wasn't jewelry. This was raw wealth, hidden and forgotten beneath the roots of trees that had stood for 1,000 years. A sound from the cabin, Emma calling out in her sleep, snapped Sarah back to reality. She shoved the diamonds back into the opening, replaced the stone slab with shaking hands, kicked dirt and pine needles over the spot. Her heart hammered so hard she felt sick. She stood there in the darkness, trying to steady her breathing, trying to think clearly through the adrenaline and shock. Vera had known. That journal entry, "I was right, God help me, I was right." She'd found this cache decades ago and kept it secret, lived in poverty while sitting on a fortune worth, what, millions? Tens of millions? Why hadn't she used them? Why had she died alone in a nursing home when she could have lived anywhere she wanted? Sarah walked back to the cabin in a daze, checking on Emma before collapsing onto the sleeping bag they shared. Sleep was impossible. Her mind kept returning to those stones, their cold weight in her palm, the impossible choice they represented. She could take them. Right now. Load them into the car, drive back to Sacramento, find someone to buy them. Emma could have a real home. Medical care. College. Everything Sarah had never been able to provide. But something held her back. Vera's stubbornness. Her refusal to sell this land even when she needed money. That careful notation in her journal, as if she knew the discovery was dangerous. As if simply knowing about the diamonds had frightened her. Dawn came gray and cold. Sarah made oatmeal from Ruth's supplies, forced herself and Emma to eat, then spent 2 hours making the cabin look more presentable before Patricia returned. She hung blankets over the broken windows, swept again, arranged their meager possessions to suggest permanence rather than desperation. When Patricia's sedan finally appeared through the morning mist, Sarah met her outside with Emma at her side, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Patricia walked through the cabin slowly, making notes on her tablet, asking questions about water source, heating, safety concerns. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could read the doubt in the pauses, the way she lingered on the damaged roof, the gaps in the floorboards. "Mrs. Mitchell," Patricia finally said, "this is barely adequate for summer occupancy. What's your plan for winter? This elevation gets serious snow. The access road becomes impassable." "I'll have it properly weatherized by then," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've already made arrangements with a local contractor." The lie came easily. Patricia made another note, glanced at Emma who was staying very quiet and very still, then back at Sarah. "I'm going to recommend temporary approval. 3 months. But there will be follow-up visits, and if conditions deteriorate, or if you can't demonstrate stable income and proper schooling for Emma, we'll revisit placement options." After Patricia left, Sarah sank onto the cabin steps, relief and terror warring in her chest. 3 months. 90 days to turn this wreck into a home, to find work in a region with no jobs, to somehow keep her daughter while living in a structure that was one good stone away from collapse. Or she could use the diamonds. The thought circled like a vulture. She could take just a few. Small ones. Enough to hire someone to fix the roof, buy proper supplies, give Emma a real bed and warm clothes. Who would even know? Vera was dead. There were no other relatives, no one who would miss a handful of stones that had been buried for God knows how long. But where had they come from? That was the question that kept gnawing at her. You didn't just stumble across millions in diamonds in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They weren't mined here. Someone had buried them deliberately, marked the location, and then what? Died before they could retrieve them? Or maybe chosen not to retrieve them, for reasons Sarah couldn't fathom. She was still wrestling with these thoughts when Ruth's truck appeared again, this time with a trailer attached carrying lumber and roofing supplies. The older woman climbed out and began unloading materials without preamble, as if Sarah had already agreed to accept help she hadn't asked for. "Ruth, I can't pay you for this," Sarah said, moving to help despite her protest. "Don't recall asking for payment," Ruth replied, hefting a bundle of shingles. "Consider it neighborly investment. Can't have the only other soul within 5 miles freezing to death come December. Bad for property values." They worked through the morning, Ruth showing Sarah how to patch the worst of the roof damage, how to properly seal the windows, how to clear the stovepipes so smoke would actually draw instead of filling the cabin. Emma helped where she could, handing up nails, collecting scraps of wood. By afternoon, the cabin looked almost habitable. Still rough, still primitive, but solid enough to face the coming winter. Over coffee, instant from Ruth's thermos because Sarah's supplies had run out, the older woman finally broached the question Sarah had been dreading. "So what's your story? What brought you up here with nothing but a car and a kid?" Sarah stared into her coffee cup, deciding how much truth to offer. "I lost my apartment. My job barely covered rent as it was, and when they cut my hours, I couldn't make it work. My daughter's father isn't in the picture. No family except Vera, who I barely knew. This inheritance was literally the only option left." Ruth nodded slowly, her weathered face showing no judgment. "Mountains full of people running from something. Usually they don't last a season. You planning to last?" "I don't have a choice." "There's always choices," Ruth corrected. "They're just not always good ones." She set down her coffee cup. Vera used to say the same thing. That she'd made her choice and had to live with it, even when it cost her everything. Sarah's pulse quickened. "Did she ever tell you what she meant by that?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. Vera kept secrets like some people keep gardens. Tended them carefully, never let anyone else see what was growing. She had something here, something she protected more fiercely than those trees. I asked her once, after Thomas died, why she didn't sell and move somewhere easier. She said some things were more valuable than comfort, and some secrets were safer buried. The word buried hung in the air between them. Sarah forced herself to remain still, to keep her expression neutral. Did you believe her? Ruth's sharp eyes studied Sarah's face, and for a moment Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that this woman saw right through her. Vera was a lot of things. Difficult. Stubborn as granite. But she wasn't crazy. If she said something was valuable, then it was. And if she said it needed protecting, then there was danger in it. After Ruth left, Sarah stood in the clearing watching the afternoon light filter through the sequoia branches. The sentinels, Ruth had called them. Guardians of something precious. But guardians couldn't protect against human greed. They couldn't protect against the desperation that made people do terrible things. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah returned to the stone slab. She told herself she was just checking, making sure everything was secure, that she hadn't dreamed the whole thing. But when she pried up the stone again and shone her flashlight into the cavity, her hand reached in almost of its own volition. She pulled out a single diamond, one of the smaller ones, and wrapped it carefully in a cloth before replacing everything and returning to the cabin. In the morning light, the stone looked even more real. Sarah turned it over in her palm, watching light dance through its facets, trying to imagine what it might be worth. $5,000? 10? Enough to buy time, to make the cabin truly livable, to prove to Patricia that Emma was safe here. She was still staring at it when Emma emerged from the sleeping bag, rubbing her eyes. Mama, what's that? Sarah's hand closed around the diamond instinctively. Nothing, baby. Just a pretty rock I found. Can I see? Maybe later. Right now we need to get you washed up and fed. Ruth said there's a school bus that comes as far as the fire station, about 2 miles down the mountain. We need to get you registered. The lie tasted bitter, but what choice did she have? She couldn't explain the diamond to Emma. Couldn't risk her daughter mentioning it to the wrong person. Sarah tucked the stone into the pocket of her jeans and tried to push away the growing sense that she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Sarah walked Emma to the fire station each morning to catch the school bus, then spent her days working on the cabin. She replaced rotted floorboards with lumber she scavenged from the ruins of the old structure behind the cabin. She patched walls, cleared brush from around the property, learned to split firewood with an axe that had hung rusted in the shed. The diamond stayed in her pocket, a constant weight against her thigh. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, the right buyer. But the truth was she didn't know what to do with it. Selling a diamond required questions she couldn't answer. Where did it come from? How did she acquire it? Any reputable dealer would demand documentation she didn't have. And going to less reputable channels meant exposing herself to people who might ask more dangerous questions. Ruth stopped by twice more, bringing supplies and offering quiet companionship. She never mentioned Vera again, never asked directly about what Sarah might have found, but there was a knowing quality to her silence that made Sarah nervous. The older woman was too observant, too familiar with Vera's secrets. If anyone would guess the truth, it would be Ruth. On the 15th day, a different vehicle came up the access road. A silver Lexus SUV that looked absurdly out of place on the rutted dirt track. Sarah watched it approach with growing unease, instinctively moving toward the cabin where Emma was doing homework at the makeshift table. The man who emerged wore a suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car, his shoes already dusty from the short walk across the clearing. He was maybe 40, smooth and polished in a way that set off every alarm Sarah had learned to trust during her years of barely surviving. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ms. Mitchell? I'm Marcus Webb. I represent the Cascadia Land Development Corporation. He handed her a business card she didn't look at. I'm here to discuss a very generous offer for your property. Sarah crossed her arms. It's not for sale. Webb's smile didn't falter. I understand. Inherited property, sentimental value, I get it. But Ms. Mitchell, let me be frank. You're what, 3 weeks into living here? No utilities, no proper road access, a cabin that should probably be condemned. Cascadia is prepared to offer you $200,000 for this property. That's well above market value for undeveloped land in this region. 200,000. The number hung in the air, impossible and tempting. It was more money than Sarah had ever imagined having. It was security, stability, everything Emma needed. And yet something about Webb's eagerness, the way he'd appeared so soon after she'd taken possession, made her suspicious. Why? She asked. What's so special about 5 acres of mountainside? Webb gestured around the clearing. Prime location for luxury development. Remote enough for privacy, accessible enough for high-end clientele. The Sequoias add unique value. Imagine exclusive cabins, ecotourism, wealthy buyers who want to feel like they own a piece of pristine wilderness. You'd cut down the trees. We'd preserve the notable specimens, Webb said smoothly. The sentinels would be incorporated as centerpiece features. Everything else would be selectively harvested to make room for construction. Sarah thought of Vera's journal, her decades-long battle to protect these trees from exactly this kind of development. She thought of the diamonds buried beneath the sentinel's roots, the secret Vera had guarded her entire life. And she thought of Emma, who deserved better than this falling-down cabin and a mother who couldn't provide basic necessities. I need time to think about it, she said finally. Webb's expression flickered, just slightly, revealing something harder beneath the polished exterior. Of course. Take your time. He handed her a folder. Contract details, comparable sales in the region, our development plans. You'll see we're offering more than fair value. But Ms. Mitchell, he paused, his voice dropping to something more serious. This is a limited-time offer. Real estate opportunities move quickly. It would be unfortunate if you passed this up and found yourself unable to maintain the property. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah took the folder without responding, watching as Webb returned to his Lexus and disappeared back down the mountain. Only after he was gone did she allow herself to shake. That night, she read through the contract documents while Emma slept. The offer was real, printed on official letterwork with corporate seals and legal language. $200,000 for land that was probably worth a tenth of that under normal circumstances. Which meant Cascadia knew something. They knew about the diamonds, or suspected, or had some other reason to want this specific property desperately enough to overpay. Sarah pulled out Vera's journal again, rereading every entry, looking for clues she'd missed. The story Vera mentioned, about the old logger Hollis Tucker, what exactly had he told her? She flipped back to that crucial entry from 1978. Today I followed the old logger's tale. I thought he was drunk and spinning yarns. What tale? What had Hollis Tucker known about the sentinels and what lay beneath them? The next morning, Sarah drove to the county library in the nearest town, a 30-mile journey that burned precious gas. She left Emma at school and spent 3 hours going through archived newspapers on microfiche, searching for any mention of Hollis Tucker or unusual discoveries in the Trinity County mountains. She almost missed it. A small article from 1927, buried in the local news section. Train robbery loot never recovered. The piece described a daring robbery of a Southern Pacific train carrying a shipment of rough diamonds from the San Francisco port to a cutting facility in Reno. The thieves had escaped into the Sierra foothills, pursued by law enforcement. One robber had been killed in a shootout. The other, identified as Hollis Tucker, aged 24, had vanished into the wilderness. The diamonds, valued at the time as $300,000, were never found. Sarah sat back from the microfiche reader, her mind racing. $300,000 in 1927 would be worth, what, millions today? Adjusted for inflation, market appreciation, maybe 50 million or more. And Hollis Tucker had been a logger. He'd known these mountains, known where to hide something valuable where it wouldn't be found. And years later, as an old man, he told Vera. But why? Why confess to a woman decades after the fact? Sarah kept searching, found Tucker's obituary from 1976. He died at 73, never married, no children. Cause of death listed as complications from cirrhosis. A drunk, just as Vera had said. Maybe in his final years, dying and alone, he'd wanted someone to know. Wanted the secret to mean something instead of dying with him. And Vera had found the diamonds, realized their origin, and chosen to leave them buried. Why? Sarah drove back to the cabin with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, Marcus Webb and Cascadia Development knew about the robbery, knew the diamonds were here, and were willing to pay $200,000 to get access to $50 million worth of stolen goods. Which meant they'd researched Vera's land more thoroughly than anyone should have. Which meant they might know Sarah had already found them. She was so lost in thought she almost didn't notice the second vehicle parked beside her cabin until she'd already pulled up beside it. A sheriff's cruiser, and leaning against it was a man in his 50s wearing a deputy's uniform and an expression that suggested this wasn't a social call. Ms. Mitchell? I'm Deputy Frank Rawlings. I need to ask you a few questions. Sarah's heart hammered as she got out of her car, hyper-aware of the diamonds still in her pocket, the evidence of what she'd found. About what? Rawlings pushed off from his cruiser, his hand resting casually on his belt near his weapon. Had a call from Child Protective Services. Seems there's been an anonymous complaint about unsafe living conditions for a minor at this address. I'm here to do a welfare check. Anonymous, Sarah repeated, knowing exactly who'd made the call. Marcus Webb, applying pressure when charm hadn't worked. Can this wait until my daughter gets off the school bus? I don't want her scared by squad cars and questions. Rawlings considered, then nodded. Fair enough. Mind if I look around the property while we wait? Sarah had no legal grounds to refuse, and they both knew it. She watched helplessly as Rawlings walked the clearing, peering into the cabin, examining the improvements she'd made. He paused near the sentinels, his eyes scanning the ground, and Sarah's breath caught. Could he see where she disturbed the earth? Would he know to look? But he moved on, circling back to where Sarah stood rigid with fear. Property looks marginally habitable, he said finally. Not ideal, but I've seen worse. What's your employment situation? I'm between jobs right now, Sarah admitted. But I have savings. The lie came automatically. And I'm looking for remote work. Rawlings made notes on a small pad. Ms. Mitchell, I'm going to be straight with you. Someone wants you gone from here. That call to CPS, it's just the beginning. You've got powerful people interested in this land, and they don't like obstacles. My advice? Take whatever offers on the table and find somewhere easier to raise your kid. He wasn't threatening her, Sarah realized. He was warning her. Like Ruth, like Vera's journal, like everything about this place, there were layers of danger she didn't fully understand yet. She opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of the school bus grinding up the access road interrupted them. Emma climbed off the bus and froze, seeing the deputy, her small face going pale with the learned fear of a child who'd seen too many official interventions in her short life. Sarah moved immediately to her daughter's side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Everything's fine, baby, she said firmly, staring at Rawlings. The deputy is just leaving. Rawlings nodded slowly, tucking away his notepad. You've got my card if you need anything. But Ms. Mitchell, think hard about your choices here. This mountain doesn't care about good intentions, and neither do the people who want what it's hiding. After he left, Sarah held Emma close, feeling her daughter's trembling, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. In that moment, standing in the clearing with the ancient sequoias towering above them, Sarah made a decision. Not about the diamonds, not yet. But about whose side she was on in this fight that Vera had started and Sarah had inherited along with the land. She wasn't leaving. Not for Marcus Webb's money, not for threats veiled as concern. The diamonds might be stolen, might be cursed, might be more trouble than they were worth. But they were hers now, part of the legacy Vera had protected, and Sarah would protect them too. For Emma. For the future. For the stubborn refusal to surrender that seemed to run in Blackwood blood even when common sense said otherwise. That night, after Emma finally fell asleep exhausted from tears and reassurances, Sarah sat on the cabin steps and stared up at the sentinels. 3,000 years they'd stood. They'd seen empires rise and fall. They'd seen men kill for gold and diamonds and land. And they'd kept their secrets, roots deep in soil that remembered everything. Sarah's hand found the single diamond in her pocket. Tomorrow she would make a plan. Tonight, she would simply survive. Just like Vera had. Just like these trees had. By refusing to break no matter how hard the wind blew. The rain came 3 days later, a steady downpour that turned the access road into a river of mud and drummed against the cabin's patched roof like 1,000 fingertips testing for weakness. Sarah lay awake listening, counting the drips that found their way through gaps she'd missed, landing in the collection of pots and buckets scattered across the floor. Emma slept curled against her side, one small hand clutching the stuffed rabbit, oblivious to the storm and the weight of decisions pressing down on her mother like the low gray clouds outside. Marcus Webb had called twice more, each time increasing the offer. $225. $250. His voice had lost its polish, revealing the desperation underneath. Sarah hadn't answered the third call, had watched his number flash on her dying phone and let it ring out while she stared at Vera's journal open on her lap. The old woman's handwriting seemed to speak across the decades, stubborn and certain even in its shakiness. Some things are more valuable than comfort, and some secrets are safer buried. But Emma needed more than philosophy and dead relatives' wisdom. She needed winter clothes. Proper food. A roof that didn't leak. And Sarah needed answers before Webb's patience ran out and his methods became less civilized than anonymous calls to Child Protective Services. When morning came gray and wet, Sarah made a decision. She bundled Emma into her inadequate jacket, loaded her into the Honda, and drove through the storm to Ruth's property. The older woman's house was a solid timber structure that had weathered 50 winters, smoke rising from its stone chimney into the rain. Ruth answered the door before Sarah could knock, as if she'd been expecting this visit. "Get inside before you both catch pneumonia," Ruth said, ushering them into warmth that smelled of wood smoke and coffee. She wrapped Emma in a quilt and settled her by the fire with hot chocolate and a stack of old National Geographic magazines before turning to Sarah with an expression that said she knew exactly why they'd come. "You found them," Ruth stated simply. Not a question. Sarah's carefully prepared explanations died in her throat. She nodded. Ruth poured coffee into 2 heavy mugs, handed one to Sarah, and sat down across from her at a worn wooden table that had probably hosted 1,000 conversations just like this one. "How much?" "I don't know. Dozens. Maybe hundreds." Sarah's hands wrapped around the mug, seeking warmth. "They're buried under the sentinels, wrapped in canvas that's mostly rotted away. I think they're from the 1927 train robbery." Ruth's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes confirmed what Sarah had suspected. "You knew." "I suspected," Ruth corrected. "Vera never told me directly, but over 40 years you piece things together. The way she refused every offer for that land, even when she had nothing. The way she'd walk the property at night like she was standing guard. The way she made me promise, near the end, that I'd watch over whoever inherited after her. Make sure they understood what they were protecting." "I don't understand what I'm protecting," Sarah said, frustration bleeding into her voice. "Those diamonds are stolen. They've been sitting in the ground for almost a century doing nobody any good. Vera lived in poverty guarding them. And now Marcus Webb and his company are circling like vultures, and Child Services is breathing down my neck, and I have a daughter who deserves better than this." Ruth sipped her coffee slowly, her weathered face thoughtful. "You know what this mountain was before the loggers came? Sacred ground to the Winta people. They believed certain places held power, required guardianship. When the white men came with their saws and their greed, most of that old understanding got buried under profit margins and property lines. But sometimes, Sarah, sometimes the land remembers what it was. Sometimes it chooses who belongs to it." Sarah wanted to argue, to point out that mystical connections to land didn't pay for Emma's school supplies or keep the rain out. But something in Ruth's words resonated with the feeling she'd had standing under the sentinels, the sense that those ancient trees were watching, judging, waiting to see what she would do. Hollis Tucker, Ruth continued, he understood that. Man was a thief and a drunk, but he understood you don't take from sacred ground without consequence. He buried those diamonds there because he couldn't keep them, couldn't spend them without bringing law down on him. And the land held them, kept them safe, until Vera found them and made the same choice he did. To leave them buried. To protect them, Ruth corrected. There's a difference. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. You think Webb is the first person to come sniffing around that property? Cascadia Development is just the latest name. Every 10 years or so, someone new figures out the story, traces the robbery, does the research. They find Vera, make their offers, try their threats. And every time, that stubborn old woman outlasted them. Waited them out until they gave up and moved on to easier prey. Sarah thought of Marcus Webb's increasingly desperate calls, the deputies warning about powerful people and obstacles. How long until they stopped asking and started taking? What if I can't outlast them? What if they hurt Emma to get at me? Ruth's expression hardened. Then you make a choice. You take your daughter and run, use one of those diamonds to start over somewhere they'll never find you. It's what any reasonable person would do. But Sarah, if you run, that land becomes theirs. The sentinels get cut down for luxury cabins. The diamonds get dug up and sold to the highest bidder. Everything Vera protected, everything she sacrificed, it all ends because you chose safety over stubbornness. The words hit like a physical blow. Sarah looked across the room at Emma, absorbed in pictures of faraway places, innocent and trusting that her mother would keep her safe. What kind of person chose abstract principles over their child's well-being? But then she thought of the other choice. Running again. New city, new name, always looking over her shoulder, teaching Emma that the powerful always win and the only option is surrender. Was that any better? Was that the lesson she wanted her daughter to learn? Help me understand why it matters, Sarah said finally. Why those specific diamonds on that specific land are worth protecting. Make me believe it's more than one old woman's stubbornness. Ruth stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a leather-bound photo album. She flipped through yellowed pages until she found what she wanted and laid it open before Sarah. The photograph showed two young women, probably in their 20s, standing arm in arm in front of the unfinished cabin. One was clearly Ruth, decades younger but with the same sharp eyes. The other was Vera, serious and determined even in youth. We built that cabin together, Ruth said softly. Thomas was off working the lumber camps, saving money for materials. Vera and I, we cleared the land, laid the foundation stones, raised those walls. Took us 2 summers. And every day we worked, she'd talk about what they'd build there. Not just a house, but a life. A family. Something that would last. Ruth touched the photograph gently. Thomas died before they finished the roof. Vera found him in the forest, crushed under a widowmaker that had fallen during a storm. She could have left then. Should have. Instead she stayed, finished the cabin alone, lived there for 60 years defending it against everyone who wanted to take it from her. She turned to face Sarah directly. You want to know why those diamonds matter? They don't. Not really. What matters is that Vera decided they did. She made them the symbol of everything she refused to surrender, everything she built that couldn't be bought or stolen or foreclosed on. That cabin isn't just wood and nails. It's proof that stubbornness can outlast greed if you're willing to pay the price. Sarah sat with that, feeling the weight of inherited legacy settling on her shoulders like a physical presence. She'd come to this mountain running from failure, looking for shelter. Instead she'd found a battle that had been raging since before she was born, a war between those who saw land as commodity and those who saw it as something sacred worth protecting at any cost. The question was, which side did she want to be on? That evening, after returning to the cabin with fresh supplies Ruth had sent along, Sarah sat Emma down for a conversation she'd been avoiding. Her daughter listened with the intense focus children develop when they sense something important, her small face serious in the firelight. "Baby, we need to talk about what happens next," Sarah began. "Some people want to buy our land. They're offering enough money that we could move somewhere nice. A real house in a town with good schools. We wouldn't have to worry about leaks or cold or any of this." Emma was quiet for a moment, her fingers working at the rabbit's worn ear. "Would we have to leave the trees?" "Yes." "Would they cut them down?" Sarah hesitated, but Emma deserved honesty. "Probably. Eventually." Her daughter's face crumpled. "But Mama, they're so old. They've been here forever." "That's what Ruth said. She said they remember things." "They're just trees, honey." Sarah said it, but didn't believe it. "Not anymore." Emma shook her head stubbornly. "Great Aunt Vera lived here her whole life protecting them. Ruth told me. She said Vera made a promise to the land." She looked up at Sarah with eyes too knowing for 7 years old. "Did we make a promise too? When we came here?" Out of the mouths of children, Sarah thought, came the questions adults spent lifetimes avoiding. Had they made a promise? By accepting this inheritance, by discovering the diamonds, by choosing to stay even when leaving would have been easier, had Sarah bound them to something larger than simple property ownership? "I think maybe we did," Sarah said finally. "But promises are hard, Em. Sometimes they cost more than we can afford." Emma scooted closer, leaning against her mother's side. "You always tell me keeping promises is important. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter, breathing in the simple truth of childhood logic. Emma was right. She'd raised her daughter to believe that integrity mattered, that some things were more valuable than comfort or convenience. How could she abandon those principles now when they demanded real sacrifice? That night, Sarah made 3 phone calls on the last bit of battery her phone had left. The first was to Marcus Webb. She kept it short, her voice steady. "The property isn't for sale. Not to you, not to Cascadia, not to anyone. Stop calling." Webb's response was immediate and cold. "You're making a serious mistake, Ms. Mitchell. We've been patient, but that patience has limits." "Then I guess you'll need to learn to live with disappointment," Sarah said, and ended the call. The second call was to Patricia Chin at Child Services. "I'm formally requesting a reassessment of my case. I want it on record that I'm improving the property, that Emma is safe and cared for, and that any future complaints should be investigated for harassment rather than genuine concern." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Mitchell, are you sure you want to stay there? If you're feeling pressured or threatened, there are resources available." "I'm sure," Sarah said. "This is our home. We're not leaving." The third call was the hardest. Sarah dialed the number for the Trinity County Sheriff's main office and asked to speak to whoever handled cold cases and historical crimes. When a detective finally came on the line, Sarah took a deep breath and told the truth. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I own property in the northern foothills that I believe contains evidence related to the 1927 Southern Pacific train robbery. I'd like to report the location of the stolen diamonds and discuss proper recovery and restitution procedures." The words hung in the air, irrevocable. She'd just given up any claim to the fortune buried under the Sentinels. She'd just chosen principle over survival, Vera's legacy over Emma's immediate needs. She felt simultaneously terrified and strangely free. The investigation took 6 weeks. During that time, Sarah and Emma lived in a strange limbo, watched constantly by deputies who'd established a security perimeter around the property, questioned repeatedly by federal agents who'd taken over the case once the interstate nature of the original crime was established. Archaeologists and forensic teams carefully excavated the site beneath the Sentinels, documenting everything, recovering not just diamonds but artifacts from the robbery itself, evidence that had been buried for 97 years. Marcus Webb tried twice more to contact Sarah, then disappeared entirely when federal prosecutors started asking questions about how Cascadia Development had known to pursue this specific property. Ruth stopped by daily, bringing food and quiet companionship, never once saying "I told you so" but radiating approval in her steady presence. Emma handled it with the resilience children develop when life gives them no choice. She rode the bus to school, did her homework by firelight, helped Sarah patch new leaks and split wood for the stove. And every evening, she'd stand between the sentinels and talk to them like old friends, sharing her day, asking them to stay strong through whatever was coming. The news crews arrived a month in, turning the remote mountain property into a circus of satellite trucks and camera crews. Sarah gave exactly one interview, standing in front of the cabin with Emma at her side, and said simply that she was honoring her great-aunt's wishes to protect what she'd been entrusted with. The reporters tried to make her a hero, a symbol of integrity in a corrupt world. Sarah deflected it all, refusing anything beyond that single statement. What she didn't tell them was how close she'd come to taking the easy path. How many nights she'd lain awake calculating what even a handful of diamonds would have meant for Emma's future. The temptation hadn't been about greed. It had been about love, about a mother's desperate need to provide for her child. That's what made it so seductive and so dangerous. The final resolution came on a cold November morning. Sarah was splitting wood when a convoy of official vehicles made its way up the now improved access road. Federal prosecutors, insurance company representatives, historical society officials, they all gathered in the clearing beneath the sentinels to deliver their findings. The diamonds, they explained, had been recovered and documented. After nearly a century, the insurance company that had paid out the original claim technically held ownership. However, given the circumstances of discovery and the family's long stewardship of the site, they were prepared to offer a finder's fee. Standard protocol was 10% of recovered value. The lead prosecutor, a stern woman in her 50s, laid out the numbers with clinical precision. The diamonds had been appraised at current market value of $355 million. 10% of that was $35.5 million. Sarah felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. She reached for Emma's hand, needing something solid to hold on to. That was generational wealth. That was every problem solved, every need met, everything she'd ever wanted for her daughter and couldn't provide. However, the prosecutor continued, there are additional considerations. The property itself has been designated a historical site. The sentinels have been placed under federal protection due to their age and cultural significance. This designation comes with certain restrictions but also certain benefits. The benefits, it turned out, included a trust established for the property's maintenance, a research grant for studying the site's historical and ecological significance, and a modest annual stipend for the property's caretaker to remain in residence and provide stewardship. The amount was enough to live on, not luxuriously, but comfortably. Enough to fix the cabin properly, to provide for Emma, to build the life Vera had always envisioned. There was a catch, of course. Accepting the designation meant Sarah could never sell the property. It would remain in her family in perpetuity, or if she had no heirs, would revert to federal management. The land would never be developed, never be exploited, never become anything other than what it was, a wild piece of mountain with two ancient trees standing guard over secrets and history. Sarah looked at Emma, whose face showed neither greed nor fear, just trust that her mother would make the right choice. She looked at the sentinels, their massive trunks solid against the gray November sky. And she thought of Vera, who'd made this same choice decades ago, who'd chosen protection over profit and died with nothing but the satisfaction of knowing she'd kept her promise. I'll take the stipend and the designation, Sarah heard herself say. The finder's fee goes to establishing a scholarship fund for single mothers trying to provide for their children. In Vera's name. The officials exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this response. Ms. Mitchell, the prosecutor said carefully, that's an extraordinary amount of money to give away. Are you certain? Sarah squeezed Emma's hand. I'm certain. Some things matter more than money. My daughter understands that. Vera understood it. And I'm finally starting to understand it too. The first snow came in December, transforming the mountain into something from a fairy tale. Sarah and Emma watched it fall from inside the now properly weatherized cabin, warm and safe and home. The roof no longer leaked. The stove drew perfectly. Ruth had helped install proper insulation and windows that actually closed. It wasn't luxury, but it was theirs. Emma pressed her face against the window, watching the snow accumulate on the sentinel's branches. Mama, do you think Great Aunt Vera can see us? Do you think she's happy we stayed? Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling the solid weight of choices made and kept. I think she knows. I think the land knows. And I think that's enough. Later, after Emma was asleep in the loft they'd finally made safe and comfortable, Sarah sat by the fire reading Vera's journal one last time. She'd reached the final entry, the one that had haunted her since the beginning. I was right. God help me, I was right. But now Sarah saw what she'd missed before. A faint line of text below, written in lighter ink as if added later, almost as an afterthought. Not about the diamonds. About what matters when everything else is stripped away. About what we choose to protect and why. About becoming the guardian something precious was waiting for. Sarah closed the journal gently and placed it on the shelf beside a photograph Ruth had given her, the one of Vera and Thomas standing before the half-built cabin, young and full of hope. Next to it, Sarah placed a new photo, one the news crews had taken, of her and Emma standing in the same spot, the same determination visible in their faces across the generations. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the land in silence and beauty. The sentinels stood watch as they had for millennia, their roots deep in soil that held stories older than human greed or human virtue. And in the cabin between them, Sarah Mitchell and her daughter slept the sound sleep of those who'd found not just shelter, but home. Not just survival, but purpose. Not just inheritance, but legacy worth protecting no matter the cost. The land had tested them, as it tested everyone who came to it seeking something. And they had answered, not with perfection, but with the stubborn refusal to surrender that seemed to grow as naturally in this soil as the ancient trees themselves. Vera would have approved. The land had chosen well. Spring arrived late that first year, snow lingering in the shadows until mid-April before finally surrendering to warmth and green. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing watching Emma plant seeds in the small garden they'd marked out near the cabin, her daughter's hands confident in the soil as if she'd been born to it. 7 months since they'd arrived with nothing. 7 months since discovering the diamonds and everything that followed. The land looked different now, not just from the melted snow but from care, from attention, from people who'd chosen to stay. Ruth had brought the seeds, heirloom varieties her grandmother had grown, wrapped in paper packets with names written in faded ink. Cherokee purple tomatoes. Kentucky wonder beans. Mortgage lifter squash, named for a man who'd saved his farm during the Depression by selling seedlings. Each packet came with a story, a thread connecting present to past, and Ruth had shared them all while showing Emma how to prepare the soil, how deep to plant, how much space each variety needed to thrive. It's not about feeding yourselves, Ruth had explained, kneeling beside Emma in the dirt. You'll get food from it, sure, but that's not why we garden. We garden to remember. To keep skills alive that people are forgetting. To prove that something can grow even after everything seems dead. Most of his tips had been dismissed as the obsessions of a civilian who didn't understand how investigations worked. Some had been lost in bureaucratic shuffles between jurisdictions. A few had been actively suppressed by officials who didn't want to admit they'd missed connections that were obvious once someone actually looked. The political fallout had been immediate and ugly. County sheriffs who'd ignored Robert's tips found themselves answering uncomfortable questions from journalists and advocacy groups. Police chiefs who'd closed cases as runaways or suicides faced calls for resignation when Robert's files revealed evidence that contradicted official conclusions. The Montana Attorney General had announced a comprehensive review of cold cases throughout the state, with particular focus on disappearances that might be connected to Brennan or other serial offenders who'd operated undetected. And through it all, Sarah had remained at the center of the storm, the accidental whistleblower who'd inherited a dead man's crusade and chosen to carry it forward despite the personal cost. The cost had been substantial. Brennan's defamation lawsuit was proceeding through the courts, with his attorneys filing motion after motion designed to drain Sarah's energy and resources. The county attorney's office was defending her, but the stress of depositions and legal proceedings was taking a toll that showed in Sarah's weight loss and the dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. She'd had to take unpaid leave from her job at the county clerk's office when the constant media attention made it impossible to work without disruption. Her landlord had decided not to renew her lease, citing concerns about the police presence and media attention that had turned their apartment complex into a circus. Sarah and Emma had moved in with Lauren temporarily, an arrangement that was supposed to last a few weeks but had stretched into months. The sisters had fallen into an uneasy rhythm, with Lauren providing childcare while Sarah spent her days at the sheriff's office or in meetings with attorneys, and Sarah contributing what little money she had toward groceries and utilities. It wasn't sustainable, but neither was anything else about Sarah's current situation. The financial assistance from victims' advocacy programs had kept them afloat but barely. Sarah was living week to week, dependent on the kindness of strangers and the charity of a system that had historically failed people like her. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that Robert's property, the inheritance that was supposed to solve her financial problems, had instead created new ones that made her previous poverty look simple by comparison. But something else had changed too, something harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. Sarah had discovered that she was good at this work, at being a witness, at helping investigators understand Robert's documentation methods and thought processes. She'd spent so many years being invisible, just another struggling single mother in a country full of them, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have people listen when she spoke, to have her observations matter, to contribute to something larger than her own survival. Detective Reeves had started consulting her on other cold cases, asking Sarah to review files and apply Robert's analytical methods to unsolved disappearances. The county attorney had hired her as a part-time consultant, paying her to organize and digitize Robert's archive while helping investigators understand the context of his documentation. It wasn't much money, barely more than she'd been making at the clerk's office, but it felt different. It felt meaningful. 4 months after discovering the bunker, Sarah received a phone call that changed everything. Detective Reeves asked her to come to the sheriff's office immediately, and the tone in her voice made Sarah's heart race with hope and terror in equal measure. The conference room was crowded when Sarah arrived. Reeves was there, along with the county attorney, 2 FBI agents who'd joined the investigation after it expanded beyond state lines, and Diana Torres. They all wore expressions that Sarah had learned to read over months of collaboration, the carefully controlled excitement of people who'd achieved something significant but didn't want to celebrate prematurely. "We arrested Theodore Brennan this morning," Reeves said without preamble. 3 counts of murder in the first degree, with additional charges pending as the investigation continues. The grand jury issued indictments based on evidence your uncle collected and evidence we've gathered through DNA analysis and witness interviews. We found human remains on property Brennan owned in Wyoming. The remains match dental records of 2 women who disappeared in 1982 and 1989. We also found physical evidence in Brennan's truck that links him to Jennifer Hartley's disappearance. Sarah felt the room tilt, and someone guided her into a chair before she could fall. Theodore Brennan had been arrested. After 40 years of killing without consequence, after decades of evading justice because no one had connected the dots that Robert Mitchell had painstakingly documented, the man was finally in custody. It felt surreal, impossible, like something that happened in television dramas but not in real life where monsters usually won and justice was a luxury reserved for people who could afford expensive lawyers. "Your uncle's evidence was crucial," one of the FBI agents said, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo who'd been leading the federal investigation. "Without his timeline and surveillance documentation, we wouldn't have known where to look for physical evidence." The remains in Wyoming were buried on property Brennan had sold in 1995, property he thought would never be connected to him. But your uncle had documented his purchase and sale of that property, had noted it as suspicious that Brennan had owned land in such a remote location. That documentation gave us probable cause to search, and what we found there provided the physical evidence we needed for murder charges. The press conference happened that afternoon, with law enforcement officials from multiple agencies standing before cameras and explaining how civilian documentation had helped solve cases that had been cold for decades. They praised Robert Mitchell's persistence, his methodical approach to investigation, his refusal to let these women be forgotten even when official channels had failed them. They talked about Sarah's courage in reporting what she'd found, her cooperation with the investigation despite personal cost, her role in ensuring that Robert's life's work hadn't died with him. Sarah stood at the back of the room during the press conference, watching officials take credit for work that Robert had done alone for 40 years, watching them praise investigative techniques that they'd previously dismissed as the obsessions of a paranoid civilian. She should have felt angry, should have resented the way they were spinning the narrative to make themselves look competent instead of acknowledging their failures. But mostly she felt exhausted and relieved and grateful that Margaret Hartley and the other families would finally have answers. August brought Ruth's 73rd birthday, celebrated with a gathering that felt less like a party and more like a community reunion. People Sarah had met over the months converged on Ruth's property, bringing food and stories and the easy camaraderie of those who'd weathered hard times together. Sarah and Emma were welcomed without fanfare, accepted now not as outsiders but as part of something larger than themselves. Ruth had pulled Sarah aside as evening settled, led her to a quiet corner of the property where they could watch the last light fade from the mountains. "I'm getting old," she'd said without preamble. "Nothing imminent, but I need to know someone's going to be here when I'm gone. Someone who understands what this place is, what it needs." "You've got years left," Sarah had protested, uncomfortable with the conversation's direction. "Maybe," Ruth had agreed. "But years go faster than you think. I need to know you're staying. Not just through summer or next winter, but staying. Making a life here. Raising Emma to understand what matters." Sarah had looked across the darkening valley, seeing the distant silhouette of the Sentinels rising above surrounding forest. 6 months ago the question would have terrified her, the commitment too vast to contemplate. Now it felt like something she'd already decided without realizing it. "We're staying," she'd said simply. "This is home." Fall arrived with color that seemed impossible, the maples and aspens turning gold and red against evergreen backdrop. Emma started second grade at the small regional school, making friends with children whose families had been mountain residents for generations. She came home with invitations to birthday parties, homework assignments about local history, and stories about kids whose grandparents had known Vera. One girl's great-grandfather had worked with Thomas Brennan in the logging camps, had been there the day the Widowmaker fell. Emma had come home with this information reverently, understanding somehow that she carried a piece of living history, that the people she was meeting weren't just names in Vera's journal but threads in a continuous narrative that stretched back beyond memory. Sarah had found work, piecing together income from tour coordination, freelance writing about the property's history, and occasional consulting for other historical preservation projects. It wasn't steady or lucrative, but combined with the stipend it was enough. More importantly, it was work that mattered, that contributed to something beyond mere survival. The first snow came early that year, October flurries that didn't stick but announced winter's approach. Sarah and Emma spent evenings by the fire, reading books Ruth loaned them about the region's history, about the Winta people who'd lived here first, about the lumber boom and bust, about all the lives that had intersected with this land over centuries. Each story added layers to their understanding, revealed how many people had loved and fought for and sometimes died protecting places they believed sacred. On the anniversary of their arrival, Sarah walked alone to the spot where the diamonds had been buried. The excavation had been carefully filled in, the ground allowed to recover, but she could still see the slight depression where the earth remembered disruption. She knelt there, placed her hand flat against soil that was already beginning its long process of forgetting human interference. "Thank you," she said quietly, unsure who she was addressing. "Vera. The land. Something larger than both. Thank you for trusting me with this. I hope I'm doing it right." The wind moved through the sentinels above her, their branches creaking in a language older than words. Sarah had learned to hear it not as sound but as presence, the awareness that some things were too large and too patient to be fully understood by human consciousness. The trees had stood before she arrived. They would stand long after she was gone. Her role was simply to protect them during her brief tenure as their guardian. Winter settled deep and cold, snow accumulating until the cabin was nearly buried, the access road impassable for weeks at a time. Sarah and Emma learned the rhythms of true isolation, of depending on what they'd stored and prepared, of entertaining themselves without screens or distractions beyond books and firelight and each other's company. It should have been hard, probably would have been unbearable for many people. Instead it felt like sanctuary, like the world shrinking to manageable size. Emma's 8th birthday came in February, celebrated simply with a cake Sarah had learned to bake in the wood stove and gifts that were practical rather than frivolous. A new warm coat. Books about trees and mountains. A journal like Vera's, blank pages waiting for Emma's own story to fill them. They invited Ruth, who came on snowshoes carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a locket, tarnished silver on a delicate chain. Ruth opened it to reveal 2 tiny photographs, one of Vera as a young woman, the other of Thomas. This was Vera's, Ruth explained, fastening it around Emma's neck. She wore it every day until arthritis made the clasp too difficult to manage. She'd want you to have it, I think. Want you to remember that love and stubbornness aren't opposites. Sometimes they're the same thing. Emma had worn the locket constantly after that, reaching up to touch it whenever she needed courage or reassurance. Sarah watched her daughter carry Vera's memory forward and understood that legacy wasn't just property or money, but the transmission of values across generations, the quiet insistence that some things mattered more than others. Spring returned, the second cycle completing, and with it came confirmation that their first year had been successful by all measures that counted. Emma was thriving, happy in ways Sarah had never managed to provide before. The property was maintained and protected, the sentinels standing watch over land that would remain wild and sacred. The scholarship fund had helped 3 more families, ripples spreading outward from choices made in faith rather than fear. Sarah stood in the garden one morning in April, watching Emma plant the same heirloom varieties they'd started with, continuing the cycle. Her daughter worked with easy confidence now, no longer tentative or uncertain. The child who'd arrived frightened and displaced had become a mountain girl, competent and strong, rooted in soil that had claimed them both. Ruth joined them later, moving slower now but still steady, still present. The 3 of them worked in comfortable silence, hands in earth that was finally warm again, bringing life back to ground that had seemed dead just weeks before. It was ordinary work, unremarkable to anyone watching, but Sarah understood its significance. This was what mattered. Not dramatic gestures or grand statements, but the quiet daily choice to tend what you'd been given, to pass forward what you'd received, to stand guard over what couldn't defend itself. That evening, after Emma was asleep and the cabin was quiet, Sarah took out Vera's journal and opened it to the blank pages following that final cryptic entry. She'd never written in it before, had felt presumptuous adding her words to Vera's. But now it seemed necessary, the story incomplete without her chapter. She wrote simply, without poetry or pretension. About arriving broken and desperate. About finding diamonds and choosing differently than desperation demanded. About learning what Vera had known, that some things were worth protecting regardless of cost. About Emma growing into someone who understood legacy not as burden but as gift. And then, before closing the journal, she added one final line. A message for whoever came next, whoever inherited this responsibility when Sarah's tenure ended. The land chooses its guardians carefully. Trust it. Trust yourself. And remember that wealth isn't what you take from the earth, but what you give back to it. She placed the journal on the shelf beside the photographs, 3 generations now documented in images and words and the living continuation of their shared commitment. Outside, the sentinels stood dark against star-filled sky, their roots deep in soil that held secrets and diamonds and the bones of everyone who'd ever loved this place enough to fight for it. Sarah stepped onto the porch, breathing in cold mountain air that smelled of pine and snow melt and earth waking from winter. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Water dripped from the cabin's eaves, the sound of ice surrendering to warmth. Spring rising again, inevitable as sunrise, bringing with it the promise that what had seemed dead would bloom, that what had been broken could heal, that the land always, always remembered those who loved it well. She stood there a long time, watching stars well overhead in their ancient patterns, feeling herself part of something vast and patient and enduring. Emma slept safe inside. Ruth lived down the mountain, keeper of knowledge and connection. The sentinels stood watch, as they had for millennia, as they would for millennia more. And Sarah Mitchell, broke single mother who'd arrived with nothing but desperation and a daughter to protect, had become what she'd never imagined possible. A guardian. A steward. A link in a chain stretching backward to Vera and Thomas, to Hollis Tucker and his burden of stolen diamonds, to the wind, to people who'd known this ground was sacred long before property deeds and land claims. And stretching forward to Emma and whoever came after her, generations yet unborn who would stand in this same clearing, feel this same connection, make this same choice to protect rather than exploit. The land had tested her. The land had claimed her. And in claiming her, had given her back something she'd lost without knowing it was missing. Not just home, but purpose. Not just survival, but meaning. Not just existence, but legacy. That was enough. That was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.